Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Sorry about the slight delay there. I was just converting some files. But Dr. Flip Blood is joining us again. If you've been watching World War II TV for some time, you know he appears every now and then. And whatever the subject, he manages to bring trains into the conversation somewhere. Well, how could I do a Railways week on this channel without bringing Dr. Phil in? So I'm bringing him in now. So it's not going to be a terribly serious study. He's been studying lots of very serious things for his actual career, writing career. So we're going to do a sprawling conversation about the young Philip Blood watching train spotting on platforms, and we're going to talk about war films, how they affect the war, etc., etc. So I'm going to bring in Phil now. Good evening, my friend. How are you today?
Very well, Woody. Thanks very much for that. Cool.
Cool. Well, I mean, you do like your trains, and you're here to talk about trains. So, so you've got a PowerPoint. We've got a couple of clips there. So I asked the same question to Gary yesterday. As the young, before you were Dr. Blood, the young Blood Junior, was it military history or trains that got your attention first, or was it both?
Trains.
Or football? Trains.
Okay, because there were two there. If it was football, then we're kind of pushed because 1962 is my first game to see United play.
Okay. I have to say, in my case, I do connect trains with football a lot because of the old supporter trains going to various places. So probably my first train journeys, except with my mum and dad on preserved steam railways like Colne Valley and things like that, we're probably going to see football. So trains and football to me are intrinsically linked. But as we're finding out this week, during the war, they were intrinsically linked, and they also are big thematic in movies and war movies and movies. They represent so many things. Sexual, even trains going into tunnels is very sexual. But let's not go down that path, down that track. So Phil, let's start. Would you want to start with a video clip, or do you want to start with
well, let's start with the first screen and the first slide. Yeah. Okay. So the way I would kind of frame this is we're living now in a kind of a post-railway age, and certainly in terms of the Second World War, there's not that much left, and what's left is a bit of a ruin. So, here's a railway station that's memorialized in Berlin, the Anhalter Bahnhof, and if you look to the side there, you see the remains when it was destroyed in 1960 or so. And what I was trying to think about when you asked me to do this was, what do we see in a ruin? I mean, for me, I see a railway station that was opened in 1841 and closed in 1952, and a whole stack of history. So much history that it's incredible, and we've and to a certain extent, a lot of it's been lost. You wouldn't imagine looking at that Mussolini and Hitler would travel up and down that railway line, greeting each other and doing their things. At the same time, many of the Berlin Jews who were deported to Theresienstadt went through that railway station. Just to make sure there's a little bit of lightheartedness, I actually wrote a novel about it, but I'm not going to I'm never going to publish it. Never publish it. So
I didn't know you'd written a novel. That's another string to your already large and ungainly bow. But anyway,
it's a big bow. Anyway, so if we just have that slide there, which is my past, but just to set the mood, if we have the first steam train MP4.
Here we go. So we're going to play a little clip there, folks.
This is on the Severn Valley Railway.
Who doesn't love the sound, eh?
That's right.
On away.
So I wanted you to just sort of set the scene, because with that you can see certain things happening. One is obviously the locomotive, which dates back to the late 1940s and in preservation, but it's the fact that young people are driving it. When I first started to take an interest in trains, it was all older guys. The original, the last steam engines, of which there's two here. And by the way, the two black and white steam engines, one above the other, they're an area where I was brought up in Manchester, in a place called Crumpsall. And as you can see, they were older crews, but they're still working on the coal trains. And all our houses in those days were still coal fired. So that's a complete industry, but not just the steam trains, the railway lines, the sidings, the coal, that's all disappeared. And so when you see a preserved train and you see young people driving it, okay, there's a lot of recreation there, a lot of the living history, but also an awful lot has been lost. And that tends to get forgotten. I think when we were listening to the talk last night, how much evidence about the fuel that was being delivered to the airfields, that whole story has completely vanished. And it's a similar situation with the living history with railways. And I'm saying this before we get into the Second World War stuff, that there's this whole architecture, this whole landscape has completely vanished. And so things that I did, like here, these kids at Manchester Victoria Station, I mean, one of them could have been me. We would stand there with books like this from Ian Allen, and we'd tick off numbers and do our thing. Now, obviously, that for me was great pleasure, apart from Saturdays when United were playing. But if I went to, look back over 30 years ago, which was 30 years after the last steam trains, one of those old steam engines came into Manchester Victoria, and I took a picture of it in colour. But the interesting thing here is, what perhaps nobody has picked up on yet, is that the two black and white pictures are War Department steam engines that were produced in the 1940s. And the model for them was the colour picture, which is a Stania 8F locomotive, which were the main model for British locos. So really just setting a scene there and giving an idea of what attracted me to these things. I mean, they were fascinating, not just because every time I walked past the railway bridge and looked over the top and saw these steam engines working on the yards, but it was also the community thing of collecting loco numbers, because there were little tricks. If you underlined them, it meant you bid in the cab. So you not only ticked your numbers across, you underlined them for cabbing, and then you actually traded your books with your mates.
Right.
So you could work out where the best place was to see trains, locomotives, which you hadn't seen yourself. So you would, it was all a bit of a social thing. Anyway, if we move on, and if you look back then in the 60s, the kind of books that were around for reading, and you can't imagine that there were two religious men, two reverends, the railway reverends they call them. One was Wilbur Aubrey, who's famous for the Thomas the Tank Engine. He's the black and white picture. And somebody I particularly liked was Eric Tracy, who became a bishop. And he was a remarkable photographer and historian, sort of like a living historian of steam as it was disappearing from the 1920s right the way through, until he died literally on a preserved railway train which was going up to Hellifield. And another chap was O.S. Knock, who was a railway engineer, and he published these books, and they're prolific with information, except there's no bibliography or archive section. So you never he'd make all these comments. There's no way you could trace them up, and it was obviously between the railway men they passed comments. Well, you should mention this or you should mention that. It was never officially recorded. So the whole architecture of railway historiography was completely manufactured towards opinion and what people liked, rather than any kind of serious academic study. And at this point, I'm going to say I'm not mentioning beaching. Okay.
Right. No, let's not do that. Yeah, I mean, an interesting, Phil, because with Gary last night, in your youth, when you were obviously fascinated by trains, these books that we're talking about there was no military wartime content to them. That study of history was kept separate from the railways. Is that your experience?
Well, O.S. Knox's book, Britain's Railways at War, is everything but Britain's Railways at War. It's, okay, they're getting blitzed and they're supporting the Dunkirk troops coming back and all that kind of thing. But actually, the British trains are spending most of their times overseas. So all of that story was rarely mentioned. So what you had was pure railway. And in the military history sections, at this stage, the only real military history about something like Normandy was Chester Wilmot. So we didn't have a kind of literature base that we have today. And for me, as I say, at this stage, until 1967, 68, trains was my thing. So if we move on. So my first film is Brief Encounter, which I'm sure people will find very strange why I picked Strange Encounter. It's one of those films which is regarded now as the ultimate British classic, and it's it's actually made round about February 1945 from a play. So they've, Noel Coward already had the whole process set up and made this very quickly, and it was an incredibly successful film. What interests me about Brief Encounter, being a train buff, is that the lady to my left is watching the train. So we're into this, what Michel Foucault refers to as the gaze. So she is looking at the train. The train is not completely visible, but we know it's a steam train, and there is an image there. She is actually looking towards her man, or the person that she was possibly having an adulterous affair with, and then of course the picture to my right is the steam engine racing through the station, which is another constant. So you go all the way back to the General with Buster Keaton. Have people gazing at trains, and you have trains racing past very fast. What's interesting me about the film as a war film is the fact that in 1945 soldiers were coming home and families were being reunited, and there was this problem. There was this issue with families who are being reunited where maybe adultery or some kind of relationship has taken place, or even breakdown of marriage, and it was being dealt with very, very early on. And it's one of those films I find quite fascinating. It's a social study of the war without actually the war being really mentioned.
Yeah, and it's Trevor Howard not wearing a uniform. I mean, I can think of very few films Trevor Howard was in where he wasn't either an officer or a duke or a judge or something. But in this, he's a civilian, and I think it's one of my mum's favorite films. It's that trains that pass in the night metaphor of the fact that the war did bring about all these brief encounters. I mean, it's the clue is in the title, isn't it? These moments of escape from a situation that was very stressful and very traumatic, and people trying to find a moment of normality, and then the trains chuffing their way through it, giving that sort of sexual connotation as well. I mean, it was for its era. I think it's a remarkably frank film.
Frank. And it's touching on things like temptation, and I think on that point, I think it's an absolutely lovely film. But I haven't appreciated it until maybe in the last few years, when I first watched it again, when I was writing something about railway social history. I just realised I'd kind of missed it, and then by looking at it, I suddenly realised I had to reflect on it. because there was something echoing in the past, and we'll come to that in the next slide. So if we move on, so here's something interesting. So I go to university in 1978, and I'd assumed that trains were over. Okay, so if you want to know my flip point, the flip point was 1967-68 was my great-grandfather's 100th birthday, and all the relatives all turned up, and because in those days it was a big event. And all the uncles and veterans of the Second World War and the First World War were all present. And it suddenly dawned on me, I had all these interesting people in my life. And the Second World War suddenly, and the First World War, suddenly took a huge interest. And then, when I finally got to university after some trying moments, I went into Lancaster University in 1978, and lo and behold, someone said to me, there's a steam engine shed. So I trooped over there, and what fascinated me about Carnforth Engine Shed was the sheds had actually been built in 1944 by German prisoners of war. And so I came to work, I came as a volunteer to work on the engines, and you'll see there Flying Scotsman 4472. She was one of the first locomotives I actually worked on. And then some of the others, and I was only a grease monkey. I mean, I'm not doing anything special. I was just trying to do stuff to make the engines work, and pick up something about them, how they function, things which okay, my father was an engineer, an aviation engineer, and he loved talking about engineering items and trains and planes and what have you. But what you learn about actually playing with locomotives, and you're greasing axle boxes, like, came up in discussion yesterday, to stop the bearings from melting and getting a hot box and the whole train being a problem, seizing up. So you learn all of that stuff, and the locomotives were really, truly fascinating, because you're not just watching them through the lens of a camera, you're actually getting them to work. So if we can just move on to the next one. So I've called this Brief Encounter Revisited, because everybody used to take the mick that I never understood what Brief Encounter was when I worked there. What I hadn't realized was Brief Encounter had been filmed at Carnforth, where I was working as a volunteer. And so as we're getting the engines to go out to work, and I've taken photographs, and these two Black Fives are working, preparing to go out onto the main line, and you see one train with smoke on the station. That's on the Hellifield line. Now, if you look at the picture in black and white with the ring, you can actually see the Hellifield and Skipton signpost from the film, with an LMS locomotive, London Midland Scottish locomotive, in the background. Well, I've actually done that in a kind of a strange kind of way. I mean, I don't know what you would call that, but it's like living history becomes part of a film, becomes precursor to later life. So there you are. So that's my kind of trip with railways, and from working at Carnforth, my relationship with railways changed significantly. At the same time, I was doing military history, or history and politics and strategic studies. So that's where the two come together as a more meaningful juncture. So
cool.
If you want to move on, if you want to say,
I was just thinking, we met you having got off a train. I'm just thinking that was the first time we met. Is that we came into the city and we met you getting off a train. So there we are. Trains connects everything.
I do love my trains, I must admit. Yeah. I'm very nerdy, I suppose, about this. I mean, but then, I understand people who like their Panther tanks and Tiger tanks. And, if somebody says to me, what do you know about a Panther tank? Well, I'll say about 5,000 to 6,000 of them produced, Maybach 12-cylinder engines and litre engines and what have you. I can have an understanding of them. But with steam trains, I've actually worked on them, whereas, when I've gone to tanks, they're either in the museums or they're going around a circle at Bovington or some such. And it's not quite the same, and you'll see why a little bit later. So anyway, this is what we're doing now is my nerdy take on trains. on war films. And my first pet hate is the bridge at Remagen, which I know we went there and
We did. We went there together. Yeah.
November 2022. You see the gang all there. I stepped away from you all while you were talking away and took a picture of you all standing on the embankment looking towards the other side of the Rhine with the two twin towers there. But no, they made this film, and when I first saw it, I thought, even when I was younger, I thought, it just never really appealed to me. It was only when I was at university I discovered that the film was being made during the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that they had to rush the film out. So I was towards it. The things now, when I look at it, is the steam engines and the wrong angle of the trains. I mean, if you remember, if you were on the other side of the bridge from where our photograph was, as you were standing on that point, I remember you were looking over the top, you could see trains going underneath. So the bridge actually crossed one railway line, which was running down the line along the Rhine River. And then there's the train that goes across and goes into Remagen itself. But in the film, as you can see, it's having to cut, the train's coming around at an angle, which it would never have done. And then the engine that they use is this Czechoslovakian tank locomotive, which, the whole thing just doesn't work for me. So if we work on to the next one, you can see that this is this little Czech locomotive that they use because they're in Czechoslovakia. And I appreciate that. But, for reality.
See, I love the opening of that film. And what I see, and you can disagree with me, is I see the fact they're showing the Germans on a train is they're showing the Germans are restricted. They haven't got kind of freedom of movement. They're losing the war. Whereas Americans in the Shaffies, meant to become Shermans, I guess, have got the mobility. They're the fast moving ones. And it's kind of a race between new tech and old tech. That's how, I don't know whether the filmmakers had that in mind, but that's what I see in the opening sequence. I see two competing military systems, in a sense. I don't know what your take on my view is.
That's fair, because there is, as Omar Bartov reminded us some time ago, about the demechanization of the Wehrmacht as it's collapsing into, an ancient form with horses and no mobility, and it's the end of the war and they're collapsing. I can see your take there. I mean, that's fairly reasonable. The train's rushing away, but I'm not sure it will be going that way because I had the train on one side of the river, the Americans on the other, and the train's trying to cross to the side of the river where the Americans are.
You're not supposed to notice those minor geographical details. We're just meant to embrace the music, embrace the chase. But, I'm with you though. Yeah, but. Your next choice, we'll move on. Stalingrad, 1992, one of the several versions of Stalingrad on film. But it's funny, until you sent me the slides, I didn't think of that as a train movie. But of course, there is that quite extended sequence of them going. Well, I'll let you explain why you chose it.
I chose it because I don't like many Stalingrad films. I don't like the ones in black and white, and I certainly don't like what's been made lately, including that sniper bomb thing. I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, the thing about this is, okay, you've got the soldiers there gone from Italy. I don't know why they needed to use an Italian electric locomotive taking German troops from the Italian coast to Stalingrad, and then you end up with a Finnish steam engine on a kind of an embankment high level piers, taking the train into what I presume is some kind of factory, which represents hell. I understand all the symbolism going on there, and I can understand the troops in the train drinking booze and going on the way. And I can actually, I'm not going to do it on this time, but I've got a quote from somebody who wrote about that kind of situation. I'm going to use it a little bit later for another film. But it's a very familiar idea that somehow the trains are so packed, there's stuff everywhere, and they're going away to the east and never to be seen again. My concern in 1942 is that's not how they would be. Yeah, they would be jammed in, but the Germans wouldn't be in chaos. And you get the impression that there's an element of chaos there. I think in 1942, the trains they'd be jammed. They would be, ram-packed, but they wouldn't be stuff all over the place. That just doesn't fit with me. And if you go to the next slide, I put in here, this is a 1943 wagon that was converted to a personnel train in 1943. So it's similar to the kind of things that German soldiers would be moving in. And you can see they put all the bits and pieces and items back together with the luggage and what have you. And it would have been more of an orderly sitting there like they would on the trucks. I noticed when I was writing Birds of Prey and I was looking at the troops when they were first moving from their depots to the forest, the German soldiers were very orderly on their troop transportation. A lot of it's to do with how they get on, and this is something that was being raised yesterday. It's something about the way they get on and the way they get off, that they're very, very super efficient. And so having stuff strewn all over the place isn't effective in German military thinking of transportation of troops. Okay. So it's just, those are my thoughts on that film, and also the fact that I don't particularly like Stalingrad, because I can understand why they want to make that kind of dramatic film. It just doesn't do anything for me. I think maybe because I've read so much and I've met relatives who lost family in Stalingrad and got to know people who were all involved in all of that from a different perspective. I guess it's like the Battle of the Somme. I don't like looking at films about the Battle of the Somme because I had an uncle who was killed there and it's very traumatic in the family. And I think I have the same situation with Stalingrad. Perhaps I've just lived in Germany too long and I'm very empathetic with the people who've had some kind of issues with Stalingrad. So I just find it very uncomfortable. It's just that it's a topic that doesn't work for me.
To me, it's the best of the Stalingrad films, but the others set a low benchmark, it has to be said. So it doesn't need to be particularly good to be the best. I have to say, each time I watch it, I find it less appealing than I did the first time. I think the first time I found it quite revealing about the German infantry experience, but I think I see it as a bit contrived now. I think I've grown up a bit, and I see it's trying too hard in some ways. But it's an effective movie in some ways. But I'm intrigued about what people think of it in the side comments there. But the next one is one of my little favorites. So Hannibal Brooks. I mean, Oliver Reed, elephants, trains. What's not to like? What is not to like?
Well, I did put it in red, Hannibal Brooks, which means if it's in red, it tends to mean that I'm very in favour of it. Now, as you know, because we did a film show some time ago when we first. This is one of my favourite films, and I love it. I don't particularly like the bit where the elephant destroys a little train when Paki tries to blow it up, later on. I think that it's an Austrian private railway. It doesn't do anything for me. But this one, I just love the opening because you've got this German Class 50 locomotive from that period of time transporting the troops. And it's the first time in all of these films that you actually get some accuracy. It's almost like they said, okay, well, we'll have a real train. And of course, it's in Munich. So and it's on the Munich railway network. So there is that kind of accuracy. So I'd often quite watch the opening just because I like the Class 51 steam engines. Now, what is interesting about this, and it's going to come up repeatedly in the films that we're discussing, is that train no longer exists. So now we're hitting something that happened in all of these films, is what happens when the locomotive's gone. Does that mean the film then becomes a little bit of a history? It's recording something that no longer exists. That's, that engine has gone. And I think it's an important part of war films, that at the time when they were being made, it wasn't a concern. But what they've become now is to represent something that's lost to us. And so,
Yeah. Decision Before Dawn, that film made in 1951 that was all filmed in still war damaged Germany. Who was Oscar Werner was a star of that one, wasn't it? And to me, it's 2 hours of effectively footage of what it was like in Germany after all the bombardments. Although the film itself has an interesting story, it's just as effective as a document of the destruction, because you're looking at real bombed out cities. I'm okay. It was made 5 or 6 years after the conflict, but it was all still there. So you're right. Some of those movies are now documenting the era. I mean, I think as we're talking about the living history at the railway events in the UK, it's a very an easy way to create time and place, isn't it? A steam engine instantly transports someone back to an era, and you can choose to go back to Victorian or the 1930s, but it's a really very effective way. But it's also an effective way of spoiling it really badly, like at the end of Dunkirk, which I know some people don't like anyway, but it's clearly, whatever it is, 1960s British rail train they're sitting in. It looks awful. The seats are how I remember them as a kid. So, it's easy to lose it as well.
I'm not keen on Dunkirk as a film. I like the old one with Mills and the guys.
They're both good in different ways. But let's move on to your next, because your next one, I mean, what an absolute classic.
Yeah, I have to admit, this is my all-time favorite railway train movie, apart from Buster Keaton's The General.
Right.
I know it's crazy to like a silent movie with trains, but I was, if you took me back to the 60s, my grandmother, I'm sat there watching Buster Keaton, I just could not stop laughing. I only have to look at his face and I can't stop laughing. Kind of get the same thing with Burt Lancaster for a different reason. I'm not very keen on Lancaster. I don't like. My hero in the film is Papa Boulle. Michel Simon, who plays the older man, and I can relate to him because that's what the old railwaymen were like. Completely miserable. They would, if you haven't got a ticket, get off the train. Can I go into the cab? No. they were very much like that. So he kind of fits that role model of the hero. And of course, the other thing he does is to drive the steam engine through the air raid as the raid's going on. And I put this picture here because, again, this is a steam engine that ran that route, and it has gone. But not only is the locomotive gone, but the whole class have gone. So what you're actually looking at is something that really is quite valuable because those steam engines don't exist anymore. And they were very important to the French railways between 1900 and 1945. So if we could just go on to the next one.
Just briefly, what I've got to say about the train, for me, it's alongside Sand Pebbles with Steve McQueen, where Steve McQueen and the engine on the ship is his co-star. To me, Burt Lancaster and the trains are equal co-stars. I mean, it's the whole mechanism of the railways. It's the signal boxes. It's the points. The whole. He's not my favorite actor either, but in that movie, he is at one with the railway network, and he'd hurt his ankle in the previous film, and he does the whole movie with a limp, which is a genuine limp. And yet he's physically here. To me, he doesn't look like an actor. He looks like a person who absolutely gets and loves trains. I bet he was a train spotter as a kid. I think. I've got a biography of him, but I don't remember reading that. But to me, it's him and Steve McQueen in those respective movies are co-starring with the machinery.
Well, I think if you remember when he goes down the ladder, when Papa Bull's running the train and he's going down the ladder and he shouts at Bull to stop and get off, you crazy fool, and Bull says, throw the points. I mean, that little click there is just incredible. The 4 shots I put together here interest me because, first of all, you've got an armored train. In the history, there's people who obviously have written about armored trains, but nobody really kind of puts them all together and understands what these armored trains are doing. So to actually have an armored train up front and in your face in the film was quite something. We of course go back with, if you look at the 2 locomotives about to crash, that goes back to what's been consistent throughout railway filmmaking, which is to destroy a train, and there's an appeal to destroying a train. They destroy an actual train in Hannibal Brooks, and this one they're about to destroy. Both the locomotives disappear. They get taken off to the scrapyards. The bombing of the locomotive works, that actually, well, it's not so much, it's not actual bombing. They actually blow up the old railway line area because it was being made redundant and flattened for electric trains and what have you. And that's not unusual either, because I think if you remember in the film Battle of Britain, at Duxford, they blew up one of those 1942 hangars. I can't remember. It was something that was quite famous, and they just blew it up. Sadly, now that's gone, and it's the same with the railway yards. Now, on the last picture is the steam engine that she's trying to race away, and Burt Lancaster's really pushing the regulator to get this engine out. And the steam engine is attacking it. The Spitfire is attacking it from behind, and that, of course, is the proper way to attack a steam train. And I know that because I've spoken to several pilots, but one of them was Wing Commander Johnny Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And he made a very strong point of saying you go down the line because the train can't escape. Because if you try and go at right angles, the engine can be out your focus very quickly. So you follow the line and you try and take it out because you can keep the momentum of fire constant on the locomotive. So, I think somebody who put those four sequences together probably knew what they were doing.
Yeah, no, it's a great film. Absolutely.
So just to show viewers that what still exists, similar locomotives to the two that are being destroyed and the one that Papa Bull was driven, you can find in the French National Museum in Mulhouse. And there is actually an armoured train in the Polish Railway Museum, or there was when I was there, in Warsaw. So, no.
Cool.
Not much to discuss there, really. So I thought I'd move on to another theme now, which is, how war and trains has worked as kind of in social, cultural history. And going back now again to where I was at university in 1979, Fassbinder's film, The Marriage of Maria Braun. It fascinated me because we in Britain hadn't really understood the impact of the war on Germany and Germans. And the idea that people were walking around with a cardboard board placard on their back with the picture of the soldier, the husband, the loved one, the children, just seemed strange. And the more I took an interest in German history, to see that this was going on until the 1950s. And then something that I found very interesting that Fassbinder was doing, which had kind of moved on. So you've got the brief encounter. She's looking at a train. She's giving it the gaze, looking for her husband. But what Fassbinder does, which I found fascinating, was he used the brake system in the German steam trains, the Westinghouse brake system, which makes this tapping noise, as like a sound to her making decisions in her mind as to how she's going to move on. And it struck me as it was very similar to the metronome sound in the Dunkirk film of 2017, where you've got that tick, tick, ticking where you're pushing the clock. She's doing the same, but they use steam train. And what struck me by this when I listened to it again the other day for our talk here was, if I gave somebody now today the sound of, an ordinary person, the sound of a brake system tapping away, they wouldn't know what it was, but they know what a metronome is. And I think that shows how much perhaps what the common sense is, the common sounds of railways and railway life that we all knew back then has now gone, and it can't so easily be transformed back into film and studies of how we lived back then. If you know. So you asked me, how's my Arkham book going on? Well, this is based on a chapter of my Arkham book. what people don't know is smuggling was quite intense from 1945 right the way up until 1950, and smuggling was about coffee, mostly coffee. There were lots of other valuables, but coffee was the thing. And it was really a battle between the British tax officers, Her Majesty's Customs, versus local Germans, because the area was under occupation by the British Army. And the British brought in tax officers and customs officers to prevent goods traveling from outside and coming into its occupation zone. So what you actually had was a battle between, and I mean serious battles, guns. And the Coffee Panzer is this vehicle in the middle, where gangs of up to 1,800 ex-soldiers with machine pistols and rifles would try and breach the border guards to get the black goods into Germany, and vice versa. The lower picture is the children. The children played a strategic part in this, because the Germans used the children to decoy the border guards, so then the heavy brigade could move in carrying massive, great big packs of coffee. And my neighbor, who'd been a German soldier, was telling me during the day he would work on the reconstruction of the city, and then in the evening they would do smuggling. And so the film here is Sündige Grenze, which is an unlawful frontier in English. I don't know if it was ever made into. I've never seen it in translated, but they made a film after the law was changed and coffee was no longer subject to customs and stuff. And apparently when the film was shown in Aachen, there was a lot of applause, like people say, yeah, we did that. And it's not a particularly interesting film, but it shows you how much something that has been completely forgotten from mainstream history but was very important in this region, made it to a film, and is still in this area fairly well known.
Cool stuff.
Now, 2 years later in Britain, you've got the Titfield Thunderbolt. Now, we had the conversation yesterday we were listening to the conversation yesterday about what happened to British trains, and the lack of investment and all the problems with them. So in Germany, they're making films about smuggling, and there's the famous film about the Marseille, the Luftwaffe pilot who was killed in the desert. And then there's a Luftwaffe general who becomes something or other, the Teufel General. In Britain, we're making the Titfield Thunderbolt, which it's a beautiful train story, and we see things happening here which are quite interesting. So we've got like the British version of Papa Bull, who's the actor in the middle, with Stanley Holloway there, who's the rich drunk. But you're also beginning to see the reverends. So the railway reverends are the guys who saved the railway system. So you can actually see, going back to that Wilbert Awdry books with Thomas the Tank Engine, there's it's already happening as a social phenomenon in British culture and British social life, to understand that all of this is all kind of inextricably linked to daily life. People are going to watch a film like this at the same time they're traveling on steam trains and the kids are reading the books. But what's happened in Germany comes back, and this is a film I know that a lot of people don't know, and I actually quite like it. It's A Time to Love and A Time to Die, and it's by Eric Remarque. And of course, Remarque is all famous for All Quiet on the Western Front, less so for this film and that book. The interesting thing is they don't pull any punches in this film. Almost from the outset, they're murdering civilians as partisans. The German soldiers are struggling, as you can see, in the cold with horses and trucks, and when they get to the point when they're on leave, the soldiers are forced to go there. That's a delousing cabinet. So there's an element of truth. Now we know that Raymark wasn't in Germany at that time because he had to flee from the Nazis, but we do see in the making of the film a large content of actuality.
Yeah, it definitely shows a lot of just sort of transport and hanging about and the boring part of a soldier's life. In my opinion, it's a good. I bought the Blu-ray a couple of years ago. It's a nice restored image. The leading man is crap. John Gavin made about half a dozen films, and he became the chairman of the Screen Actors Guild or something for the rest of his life or something. If it had a stronger leading man, I think it would have been a much better film. He's just a bit weak, a bit of a weak point, but I think the novel is as good as All Quiet on the Western Front, I think, and I think the movie is certainly better than it is remembered for being.
Yeah. Now, I just want to raise a point here. So you looked at the dates. We've seen 51, 52, 53, 58. And I'm just going to quote here somebody and see what you think. It was dark when the train from Minsk steamed into the station. All the carriages were filled with soldiers. They lay everywhere on the luggage racks, under the seats, along corridors, and in the toilet. Who do you think wrote that in 1958?
No idea.
That's the first edition of Sven Hassel's book, The Legion of the Damned.
Ah. Okay.
Yeah. We all assume that it was the 70s. He actually came out in the 50s. And if you read the profile, the bios on the back of the book, he's claimed to be this soldier with this incredible background and what have you, really being sold as an image, the German soldier. And he's coming out when this film's coming out. It's quite interesting that they've got all of this kind of revisionist, we're not Nazis, we're all good soldiers in the films. We wouldn't normally have expected that that's actually happening, not just in German books in Germany, but actually being translated and put to English audiences. You know? And that's when Sven Hassel is gradually coming on. I mean, I didn't read him until 73.
Yeah, I read him when I was a kid. It was one of those. I think in my case, me and my friends, we gravitated to him from the Commando comics. We kept on reading the Commando comics as well, but Sven Hassel kind of did the rounds. And there was also I think it was Bantam released a lot of those, but like Donald Burgett's books and Eugene Sledge. They all came out with these really aiming at kids comic book covers, and that was a big thing back when I was a kid. Those. You know, you felt it was only one step away from comics. It wasn't like reading a real book, but they were the Guadalcanal Diary, I think, came out with a really cool cover as well in that period. But yeah, I'm going off and down a rabbit hole, but
no, because
fascinating as always.
Well, I mean, imagine now somebody trying to write a novel about the Second World War of a German soldier in the Sven Hassel way. I mean, would they really be able to understand that kind of environment that the people were living in? I'm not talking about the combat, the fighting, the machine MG42s, all of that stuff. I'm talking about actual daily life of getting from one place to another, the trains, the environment, the landscape, the architecture they'd have to pass through. I mean, strikes me that they can't do that now because none of it exists, and what does exist on the preserved lines doesn't give the impression of how it was. If you see what I mean. Yeah. So I think even I'm not going to say that Sven Hassel's good, but I'm going to say something like Guy Sayer's book where he travels on a train to Bialystok. I was quite amazed at how accurate that was, given that he seemed to know where he was going, and I knew the stops and the places that he was talking about all existed. Anyway.
Okay, brilliant stuff.
So back to me. So I decided to go and look for the reality of the German railways, and the choice was East Germany or Poland. The downside was, of course, it was the Cold War, and 1983 wasn't wasn't the best of years to travel. But so we did. So anyway, let's go on, and I'll tell you about my journey. So
Brilliant.
I've included this because, you know, everyone talks about the Cold War, but actually transferring from one block to another block was quite traumatic. And if you can bear with me for a second, I'll tell you the story of what happened on this particular trip. Well, we picked up in Frankfurt a widow's train, which is all the ladies who've been allowed to travel from East Germany with certain amounts of money, would go roaming around Western shops, packing up as much gear as possible, and then jamming themselves on the train. And I can assure you, I saw old ladies pulling the length of a parachute full of boxes of beer and all kinds of things over their shoulders to get on the trains. And in our train, there were 4 ladies who completely filled the train with boxes. I mean, we had cameras in the old camera boxes because we were carrying a lot of photography equipment, but they were coming in with massive boxes. And along the journey, we got stopped, and the border guards started to come through the train, and it was very, very hot. We were between both borders. We were actually in the middle dead zone. And the Soviet guard came along, and everybody showed him a passport. He wasn't particularly interested. He carried on. The poor East German guard, as he opened the door, I suddenly realized as the ladies spat on him, he was covered from head to toe in spit. And he took the passports and he just carried on. And these women were just attacking him. And I thought, wow, absolutely, wow. Nobody talks about this stuff. Anyway, he went off. The next thing you know, Americans came in and pointed a gun at us and said, show us your passport. So we showed him the passports, and one said to the other, limey, oh, fucking limeys. And just as he's showing it on, fucking Yanks. And he kind of gave me this glare, and I gave him the finger, and he buggered off. But, you know, you could have these moments of tension. Anyway, so we get to Leipzig, and all these ladies are suddenly bundled away in less than 10 minutes. So you've had a whole train full of all of these ladies. And what actually happened was their relatives turned up with massive trucks, literally pick up the ladies, pick up all the stuff, throw it onto the trucks, and they're gone. And the station was completely clear. There was like 5 people standing there. And it was almost like it never happened. But it was truly an experience. Of all the times that I traveled to the DDR, and there was quite a lot, that was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this. It was quite something.
Wow. Sean Brennan is asking, what are those chest briefcases specifically?
Right. Well, when they flip down, they have their stamps. So they put your passport on the lid like a little table.
Right.
They go ding, ding, ding with their stamps and check your what do you call it? Your visas. And that's what they are. And they're different stamps for different things.
Right. Moving on.
Okay. So the train left Leipzig. We got to Görlitz. And I heard this steam engine sound in the background. And I was traveling with my friend Manny, who sadly passed in 2015. But we were working together, and he said, I'll grab the whiskey, you grab the cigarettes. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, so we couldn't take any photographs. We didn't have that kind of flash gear. In any case, it was really about that they were already packed. So leave it packed, just run to the train, see if we can get a cab ride. So we offered these goodies as generosity to the railway men. They kind of snubbed it and said, you know, don't want that. And but we could come in. So at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of June, I was in my first proper cab ride. And I say that because they asked us to do some coaling, and they also allowed us to play with the horn and do the regulator. And as I had a kind of an understanding of where everything was, the engine driver wasn't too bothered at all. And I quite enjoyed doing the firing, to be honest, because it meant when the firebox opened, you get this glow. And if you're coming along in the night, that glow gets into the smoke. So you get this incredible imagery of fire and smoke spreading. And if you look to the side where the locomotive is running against a forest, you can actually see the fire, the heat, and the outline of the locomotive cab just from that fire coming out there. So for me, it was just wonderful. And we got off the locomotive in Lesnica, and there was a moment when I hadn't realized what I'd driven in, but I'd driven in a locomotive, not this one, but one similar, which is a TY2 or Class 52 locomotive. Now, these are known as Kriegslocks, and the one we'd driven on had been built as 526208, and it had been produced at Schwarzkopf, part of the Berlin Maschinenbau in around about 1944. And what's interesting about these locomotives is that there were more of those produced than Panthers and Tigers combined, and that they were all produced between 1942 and 1945. So you're looking at almost 8,000 steam engines of just one class, we haven't talked about the others yet, produced across Europe for the German railways. So now you can imagine that's quite impressive when placed against what the British were doing. So if you go back to the two War Department locos and the 8F on my first slide, Britain produced 935 War Department locos in 9 factories and 852 locomotives in 8Fs in 4 factories. But then you get into another side of this discussion when you start looking at what's involved. So those 2 black and white locomotives on the side there, 935 of those were produced as War Department austerity locomotives. And the 8F, the color picture in the middle, 852 of those and 935 of the others. Now, what's interesting is the 8F is 72 tons. So they took the War Departments and tried to reduce them, and they got them down to 70 tons. Now, if you look at it in tractor effort, they got the 8Fs to do roughly take 32,440 pounds, and they upscaled the tractive effort of the War Department locos there to 34,215 pounds, which basically means a 1,000-ton train roughly running at about 40 miles an hour, roughly, and not too heavy. The Class 52, and here's the kicker, it's coming in at 103 tons, and it's running 1,200 tons of train at about 50 miles an hour, and it's not even pushed. It's not even breaking sweat at that point. So it gives you an idea of the 2 kinds of railway mentalities that are taking place here. The British have got their locomotives, which we have to say, you know, all 3 of them were seen in the colonies, working in the empire, working on the empire lines, working to maintain the empire in Palestine and Egypt and elsewhere. The German locomotives are built purely for the German system.
Right.
And they are being manufactured not only in the German factories, but also in occupied territories. So here we go now, geeky kind of military history thing. So here's some thoughts that I had at the time, and these are my notes. So Let's assume the German railways were performing at a uniform rate of between 30 and 50 miles an hour. That's a consistency.
Right.
So you don't actually have the problem of fast trains running through expresses and all the rest of it. The whole network is running at a uniform rate. That means you can do things such as create supply centers where you can build reserves very quickly because you've got a uniform rate of things coming. So if you say, right, well, we'll have a supply center north of Rome, that's very quick to build up. The supply troops, replacements, you can easily pick out where you want that to be. So you make a strategic move. So if you want Hitler's fire brigade to go from Kursk down to Italy, that's not hard to work out because all you do is you redirect. You don't need them to take their tanks with them. You just redirect replacements and supplies, resupply to the point where the trains are arriving. So they coordinate them to arrive at the same time because they're all running at a uniform rate. Bombing isn't going to disrupt you because you've got an integrated system. So you take out one line with RAF or United States Air Force. Well, that's easy. You just divert them another way. And the trains are still running at a uniform rate. When was it designed? Probably from around about the time Schlieffen decided to lengthen the platforms, put in special ramp systems to rapidly move troops from their bases into trains. But what it meant for Nazi Germany was you could run the war and you could run the Holocaust in parallel. And that effectively is what happened. So, while the Normandy operations are taking place, that fascinating thing happens. The Germans keep maintaining a flow of replacements to fuel the front. I mean, okay, they're not doing very well, and we know they lose, but they are keeping in the fight. Well, at the same time, they're moving 1 million Hungarian Jews over that period. That's a heck of a lot of transportation that's taking place. And in response to Bagration, they're moving all the panzer divisions, which were not caught up in the original attack by the Soviet Red Army in the area of Minsk. They now place them before Warsaw in preparation for a major counteroffensive to Tannenberg, the Russians. So you've got 3 major military campaigns taking place in parallel, and I'm going to say the Holocaust is a military campaign because you're actually using the railways, the strategic railways, to deport these Jews. So you've got the 3 operations taking place all in parallel and the railways functioning normally. That's fascinating.
Wow. It is. But we need to move on, I think, Dr. Blood.
We do. Next. So here's what it looks like. The train on the left, I nearly got arrested. It's full of Russian soldiers. I took the photograph. The Polish guard said, "Don't do that again. They're Russians." When the train left, everybody was spitting at the train. The one on the right gives you an idea of how scruffy and dirty these are, but still functioning. And of course, it was all during the time of martial law, which nobody told us, which added to things. Anyway, go on, next one. I said these would be very quick. You can see how dirty a steam engine is in an engine shed. The interesting thing here is it's all German equipment, support systems, locomotives, very little changed. And if we go on to the next one.
We had the question earlier about how much, from Darren Little is asking, how much of the Lend-Lease engines and rolling stock that was imported was kept and contributed to the infrastructure rebuild in Russia and Eastern Europe. Hi, Phil. Hope you are good.
Well, the American locomotives, they built 800 of these S160s from 1942-43, and they start coming into the British railway system just before Normandy. There's quite a few of them have been preserved at places like the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway Society. What was the rest of the question? American trains going to...
Yeah, the Lend-Lease stuff being used in Eastern Europe, because I'm obviously talking about East Germany at one point. So,
well, I believe the Stalin line and several of the other main railway lines which were running to support the Red Army were already using American locomotives by 1943.
Right.
It's very difficult to get accurate research on that stuff because well, it's difficult.
Okay.
So I did. This is just a cameo of what life was like. You know, the engine drivers. I got on with them all. You see a steam engine standing there at the end of a platform. Nobody's a bit interested because it's the normal thing. So why would anybody bother, apart from some stupid English guys, want to take a photograph of some dirty old steam engine? And just people carried on their work. The lady was particularly nice. It was a very hot day. I sat down and she was playing with a dog and she said, "Are you thirsty?" And she got us a couple of beers. The two guys in the train with the 95, they were absolutely pissed off. I got to know them for a few days because I was at Saalfeld engine sheds and I'd actually been in the sheds and I'd taken some instructions from them on how East German steam engines work. And these two are just about to go off duty and have a nice evening. And this dirty old diesel came in and it was a Russian diesel and it broke down and they kept breaking down because they just weren't properly bedded into the system. And this diesel broke down and these two just went on about the Russians like you could not imagine. And so I said, "Okay, well, let's take a picture of you." And they just looked at me as if to say, "We hate you as much as we hate the Russians." But no, they were all right. They were okay in the end. So shall we move on?
Yeah. So serious stuff again. Show her.
Yeah. Well, I think this film as history now is becoming really important. And I think it's something that needs to be worked on in the railway films because the Show and the Landsman, Claude Landsman's masterpiece. I mean, to me, that's everything. I don't want to, Schindler's List, fine, the steam engines in it, but that doesn't do anything for me. Shoah, the kind of documentary work, as formerly being involved in Holocaust history, for me, it is just pants down the thing that you want to watch. And of course, he managed to steal my idea of photographing the Polish steam engine driver from the previous slide, looking back. Only he was clever enough to get Treblinka in there to make sure he got the winning picture. But I'm not going to hold it against him. But anyway, if you go on to the next one. And that's what it looks like. What happens when, history moves on, the railways disappear. If you look at Treblinka now, it's, as far as I can see, it's cut off. The only way you can get there is by public transport. It was a death camp that was particularly designed to work and function with the railway line. How you explain that when there's no railway line and there's no linkages and it's just, you see pillars on the ground that represent the trains, how you can reconstruct all of that into people's thinking and memory to cope with the changes to the landscape, I don't know. But it's something that we as historians need to consider long term, because as we move away from the old architecture, which we could take for granted, I think now we have to think about the future. And this is one of those problems. So if you want to move on. So I'm going to now briefly talk about preservation and living history because I think it's important. There's two things happening here. I love St. Trinians. Don't get me wrong. I just love it. I love the music. I love Alistair Sim, the whole thing. But this one I don't like. But I do like the fact that the film is a living history because in there they portray locomotives and trains in the robbery filmed on location at the Longmoor Military Railroad. Now that railroad, as I will explain in a minute, has now gone. What it shows in this picture is just how far advanced the Americans were at creating historical heritage memorial sites. And here, this is the famous Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore with one of their classic locomotives from the 1940s. and the whole experience is fascinating because they have really gone into great depth to an understanding to create their message, and it's a superb message. Now, what fascinates me is, you know, we have these little tin boxes for preserved railways in Britain. These guys are doing a 30 million fundraising exercise in dollars, and you think, you know, that's like the difference between how the railways were in America and how the railways were in Britain, how we've approached preservation and how they preserve things. And I had to put Buster Keaton in somewhere, so I just.
I mean, it is interesting, Phil, that how the different nations that we talk about on this channel, how they view railways. I mean, I'm a big student of the American West and the taming of the West, and of course the railroad is what tied West and East. I mean, that it is the railroad that united two at that point essentially separate countries into one. So for the US, it had that important element of the founding of themselves as a world power. And then, you know, you said we weren't going to mention Dr. Beeching, and, you know, Gary told us yesterday about how thoroughly important the railways were in World War II for Bomber Command, and yet within a generation, they're being closed down in horrific numbers. The railway lines, the stations, and yet your travels to across Europe in the 80s, steam trains still the normal part of transport. So it's fascinating how that each country's journey with the railways has been very, very different over the generations.
I mean, the problem with, we weren't going to mention Beeching, but the problem with Beeching is it was all based on lies and falsification of figures. And I know that because when my father ended his career in military aviation and Avros pushed him out and retrained him for other things, he ended up working for the British Transport Commission, and he discovered to his cost that what he was doing with British Railways was actually destroying them for no purpose whatsoever, other than for people like Maples to make lots of money out of it for the road network. Now, okay, what happens with America is not much different, because the Americans destroyed much of their railway infrastructure. And, you know, you can walk. I've been to many American railway stations, and I've actually done several trips across the continent just to see how that destruction of the railway infrastructure took place. But though there is this idea that, you know, you've got to advance and progress is very important in the American mindset, there's this idea that we've been somewhere. They put that into museums, and that museum experience is something. They've been somewhere because they've created this museum to tell you they've been somewhere, and you know you've been through the process, and you've come out and you've been educated in a soft way. It's been quite pleasant. You probably haven't had to spend an awful lot of money, and they've gone out of their way to encourage you to learn and engage and be involved, which is still a problem in the West, where in Britain and Europe, where you know it's still hands off. In America, it's still hands on, get involved. And okay, people who won't want to travel on a train, who prefer to fly, will spend a weekend playing on the trains.
Yeah.
So if we go over to the next one, and you know, I've just put these two superpowers in there. There is the S-160 at the Railway Museum in Virginia. The reason why I wanted to put this GG1 in is it just shows you how far Britain was away from reality of what was actually going on in modern railways. That's a GG1, and it was produced between 1934 and 1943. And it had a tractive effort of 66,000 pounds. So it's twice as powerful as those steam engines, and yet Britain wants to continue with steam engines and doesn't consider anything like that. You know? And then it gets into all the chaos with Beeching and the diesel plan and all the rest of it. But anyway, so if we move on, two survivors from Longmoor. I happen to have a copy of Charles Meach's book, The Steam Sapper. The Longmoor Military Railway was brilliant because it was the British Army preserving steam trains, even steam trains which were not theirs, and they held on to them to allow the preservation societies to save them. Now, obviously, in 1969, the Longmoor Military Railway disappeared. But for me, it's one of the greatest shames, because railway lines, which were for purely military knowledge for soldiers and armies to work with, is still in operation in America. But the two railway lines in Germany and Britain, the Longmoor Military Railway in Britain and the Berlin-Zossen Railway in the old Prussian railways, all gone and forgotten. That's why I wanted to put that there, because it's, you know. Brilliant. And then we get the last one. And so full circle, you know, there's Vera Lynn on the left, and there's the Last Supper on the right. Severn Valley Railway, North Yorkshire Moors. I'm not the kind of person who thinks that steam should have been kept and we should have continued with it for the rest of our lives. I happen to like steam engines. I think they're wonderful beasts, but I do understand that we have to move on in progress. But I think that, you know, they've actually done a very good job in the preservation of these two locomotives. And on that point, I ended my talk with one last moment of film, if you please, sir.
I love the little 10-year-old Phil grin you did halfway through that. So where was that, Phil?
So that's Cologne Station a few years ago. The thing that goes through my mind there, and because I've been doing so much work on Aachen, that to me is a reenactment of 1918. The German army desperate to get across the River Rhine because the French, Belgium and British armies are coming in. It's after the armistice and the troop trains are racing across. I know in Aachen there was chaos on the railway lines because they were trying to deal with too many trains at short notice with too many people. So when I see that going across, it's not just the fact that it's a P8 steam engine constructed in Berlin in 1917 and some old trucks. It just relives a sense of a German steam train going back to Germany, crossing over the Rhine and carrying all the German soldiers to safety from the Allies. So I do have my nerdy emotional moment.
Well, you're allowed to, Phil. You're allowed to. Well, as always, it's been a fantastic, sprawling conversation that's gone around the houses and back again. But we've all learned a bit, and we know you a little bit better as well, Phil, I think, which is probably a good thing. So we will leave it there because I've got a coughing fit coming on. I can feel it coming on. I'm just going to take your screen. I'll bring you back in for a second to say goodbye. But folks, our show tomorrow is in the morning. So 10 a.m. UK time. Christian Walmer is joining us to talk about the history of engines at war. So we're going to go have a bit of a history lesson going back to the US Civil War, First World War, a sprawling presentation, 70 slides tomorrow morning, or very, very, very late if you're in the US, but that's tomorrow morning. But I'm going to bring Phil back in to say goodbye, and thanks everybody for watching. But Phil, our paths will cross again undoubtedly at some point again for another subject. But I feel you've got that personal one off your chest now. That was the chance to talk about trains and your childhood was weighing on your shoulders. I feel I've lifted some of that burden now.
You have. After all that time, you were saying I couldn't mention trains on your tour when you came to Aachen. So I do appreciate.
No, you did mention them a lot, though, Phil. To be fair, you know this is okay. This is a condensed hour and 20 minutes. That's not so. It was every 5 minutes for 5 days. So Yeah, you can have too much of a good thing, Phil, in my experience. But anyway, we will leave it there. So, Phil, viewers, thank you very much. I will see everybody again tomorrow. So, cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge, WW2TV, and don't forget to click subscribe and consider becoming a patron or YouTube channel member. Cheers, everybody. Bye.